You will not need to remember everything that your lecturer says in each lecture. What you do need to know is what is specified in your learning objectives and in your mark scheme. So we've all been in at least one lecture where there is so much content to cover and you feel like the lecturer is speaking at 200 miles per hour. This is a really stressful situation that I think happens way too often. You end up spending so much time rushing to get everything down on your notes that you're not actually taking in any of the information. You leave the lecture hall stressed and you feel like you didn't even learn anything. So I've gathered a few tips for you so that you're more prepared for these fast-paced lectures and you'll be more calm and collected and ready to just soak in the information without feeling stressed. Bear with me because I know this sounds incredibly obvious, but at the same time I feel like this still isn't really done that much. You should be preparing before every lecture you attend. By preparation, I mean doing obvious things like maybe reading around the subject before you go in. This does help especially on the more difficult and complex topics. For my neuroscience lectures, for example, I would always make sure that I kind of knew the basis of what the lecturer would be talking about, so that you're not then wasting time trying to wrap your head around the topic as they're explaining it. You already have some background knowledge and it's more about learning more. But also another tip for this is reading the learning objectives and actually sticking to them. I always overlooked the importance of learning objectives. It was just that boring slide at the beginning that you didn't have to pay attention to. Pay attention to it. This is basically your key to knowing what you need to focus on in your lecture and also in any of your revision. At the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of general information which is only for context that your lecturer goes over. It's important to know full context, but you don't need to have 2 whole pages written on this information when the learning objectives don't even mention this kind of knowledge. So for my lectures, what I would do is often arrive like 10 minutes early, so you can get seated, pull up the slides and start scrolling through to begin with. That way you can already get an idea of what's going to be covered, what the learning objectives are, and if it looks like it's going to be a very busy one, then it is worth maybe getting a head start on actually writing some notes down. This really helped me, and then I'd always be a few slides ahead of the lecturer, so I'd have some leeway to then add extra information and I wouldn't be rushing. This is especially helpful if there's going to be any sort of diagrams or graphs or pictures. I often waste a lot of time trying to copy and paste them into my notes as the lecturer was explaining them, when really you already want to have them down in your notes, so then you can actually add that extra information as they tell you. This is especially true if you're someone who handwrites your notes, because that means you're drawing these diagrams. That's going to take way more time, and so you either want to draw it all out before or just leave a gap so you know you can add that in later. But you don't want to be wasting precious lecture time drawing. Next, allocate a note-taking and colour system at the very start of term and stick to it throughout. No matter how basic or complex this system is, it's really important to kind of keep it consistent. It's going to confuse you more when it comes to review sessions, when different words and terms are suddenly different colours and you don't understand what your system was way back 10 weeks ago. So have a system. You could even write out a key to really remind yourself so you stick to it. And this is also going to help make note-taking more enjoyable, because your notes are actually going to look really good. For notes in general, again, very obvious, but I recommend using bullet points at all times. You never want to be writing in full sentences. This takes a lot of time and energy. At the end of the day, these are called notes for a reason. You're literally just writing down the basic information that you can then develop on later. And for your colour scheme, again, it doesn't have to be extravagant. Maybe just pick out a couple colours to indicate certain things. For example, I'd always have a certain colour for key words or key areas of the brain, for example, and then a different colour for key concepts and theories, and then maybe a third colour just to write out any examples you add so you can really pinpoint them, and then maybe one highlighter. I would then use this highlighter when revising to go over any notable points that you really want to stand out. Next, you want to listen to the lecturer. I don't literally just mean listen to them, because you should be doing this anyway, But I feel like a lot of us often get too dependent on the slides that we forget to listen to what the lecturer is saying on top of those slides. Especially in a really busy, content-heavy lecture, there's often a lot of text on the slides, so you kind of zone in on that and you think that's all you need to know. When really, actually, sometimes it's better to take a step back and just listen to what they're saying. I'd often prioritize paying attention to the lecturer over writing any notes down. This is especially true when they're elaborating on a point. You can always go over the slides later to see any text you may have missed, but at the end of the day, that really helpful example or explanation they gave to a topic that was off the top of their head is not going to be on those slides. You want to listen to that in the moment and make the most of it. This is especially true when an example is really long. It's often going to take you ages to write down and it's not even going to go into your brain right. So instead you just want to take a seat and listen and actually try and understand what they're saying. This has helped me out a lot. I remember in certain statistics lectures, statistics is not my forte, so I was already confused. Instead of rushing to write down an example my lecturer gave, I actually listened to the example. It made so much sense, and then from there, the rest of the lecture made more sense. And that's going to enter your long-term memory way more than writing it down in the moment, trying to remember it for 2 seconds, and then it leaving your brain as you try to remember the next thing. So yeah, I definitely recommend listening to the lecturer more than writing everything down. Don't think that because you've copied everything from the slide, that's all you need to know, and now you can tune out until they skip to the next slide. That information they are now talking about that you're zoning out from is probably the most important part of the lecture, and you should really tune in. Lastly, seems a bit blunt, but I think the best way to describe this point is literally just to use common sense. Sometimes it can be really confusing. There's so much information online and within each lecture that's being thrown at you. It can be really confusing to know what you need to know, and particularly what you're going to be tested on and what's the most important to zone in on. It's important not to get overwhelmed in this scenario, but actually just go back to basics and use common sense. So for this, like I said in my first point with preparation, constantly refer to your learning objectives for each topic, but also the overall module is incredibly helpful, and also your overall syllabus and mark schemes. You will not need to remember everything that your lecturer says in each lecture. You will not need to know everything in all your readings. What you do need to know is what is specified in your learning objectives and in your mark scheme. So don't waste your time copying down everything in your lectures. It's just a waste of time and energy, and it's going to stress you out more because then you'll think you need to know everything you've made a note of. You don't. And I always make sure that I don't stress myself out when I'm sitting in a lecture and I can hear everyone typing furiously. Trust yourself and what you need to know. Just because everyone's typing really fast and loudly doesn't mean that you need to be as well. Okay, so just to recap those points we went over, the first was just to prepare for each individual lecture in regards to learning objectives and any required reading. Tip number 2 is having a consistent note and, more importantly, colour scheme throughout all of your lectures. Tip number 3 is more actively listening to your lecturer and oftentimes not needing to stress about writing everything down, but actually just sitting back and listening. And my final tip was making sure that you understand the basics of your course and using common sense in regards to what it is you need to know, and not stressing yourself out about learning every single thing that's said in a lecture.